Welcome to Goodfellas History. I'm your host, Nick,
Davis.
I'm Garrett.
and today we're going to talk about populism, particularly populism in the United States, and its long-term economic and political history. Populism has been a subject that has gotten a lot of attention over the last couple years, largely due to the fact that right now, politically speaking, there are a lot of right-wing as well as left-wing factions coming to light adopting populist rhetoric and calling themselves populists to boot. But what are in fact populists? And where does the term populism actually come from? We're here to discuss that. So you fellas have probably heard a lot about populism, haven't you?
Yeah, over the years, definitely.
Especially in regards to the Trump campaign.
So populism actually gets its start in the late 19th century. In fact, it's around 1892 that the first Populist Party of America actually formed. It was formed in Kansas, and it was a third party. And many believe it was the last real third-party effort to ever take place in the United States. The populist faction was way more effective and way more popular and way more successful than the Green Party, the Reform Party, or virtually every other third-party campaign in American history other than the Republican Party. And they were the last third party to actually stand a chance on potentially challenging the duopoly of the Democrat and Republican Party that we've seen over the last, 2 centuries. So, who were the populists? I think would be a really good question. And what were they about? Well, the American populist movement were made up of 2 factions. The first faction was made up of the Farmers Alliance. Now, the Farmers Alliance was made up of sharecroppers and small farmers who basically decided to kind of unionize against big business and big money, particularly big finance. So a lot of people don't realize that near the end of the American Civil War, the Homestead Act was signed in 1862, and this led to a massive movement of population from the eastern states into what is now the western states, places where we're from. And the goal of that was this would, 1, settle the region, and 2, lead to economic stability and prosperity because everybody would have their own little slot of land. They'd have their own homestead. The underlying philosophy of this was Jeffersonian agrarianism. The idea that, citizen farmer Democrats would elect people for the Republic. There's deep-rooted romantic Republican as in little r, beliefs in this. Well, come to find out, a few decades on, the financial sector of the United States figured out a way to exploit a lot of money and a lot of wealth from this region for obvious reasons. And we're beginning to basically adopt policies that were designed to extract as much wealth from the local populations as possible. They do this by policies of either forcing the farmers into sharecropping, which was this idea that people would work the land and grow on the land, and a portion of their profits would be sold for the profit of the initial investor. This should sound a lot like feudalism, because it was actually a lot like feudalism. Difference was, instead of feudal lord living on a castle nearby observing, it was a banker living in New York or Boston, Cincinnati, or somewhere where there was commercial trade. Problem with the system was that the products that were being, or the goods that were being produced, oftentimes were cash crops, particularly cotton. So many of these merchants would adopt policies that were designed to force the farmers to grow cotton. Now, I don't need to explain to you guys that if everybody's growing cotton, so there's a lot of supply of cotton, where does that lead to? To the value of cotton.
It'll go way down.
It goes down. Now, the problem the United States was facing at the time is that we were on the gold standard, which is inherently deflationary because there's only a limited amount of gold. So, add on top of the fact that more supply of cotton was leading to a decrease in value, This meant that the money and resources that the farmer invested in growing a crop of cotton is not going to be worth the same as what's being sold in the market. So eventually it was becoming more expensive to produce cotton just because of the fact that we were in deflation and everybody else was growing cotton. Now, the same event was happening in the western states, where instead of just the sharecropping policies were put into effect, there were other anti-organization, anti-union policies that are being put into place that are designed to squeeze the farmers. A lot of it had to do with the railway, or access to the railway. Most of the financial sector, banks, ergo, held monopoly control, or held monopolies over freight rates. Well, the only place where these farmers were able to sell their goods was via freight. They needed to sell it, they needed to transport it on the trains. And the freight rates were controlled by monopolies. So this meant that the farmers themselves were unable to, they weren't able to effectively negotiate lower prices of freight, and so that their profits were now being squeezed out by these freights, by the freight rate. So the Farmers Alliance began to form. And this was an alliance between the mostly rural workers, mostly rural farmers, and it's predominantly Western and Southern in its nature. The Southern sharecroppers and the Western farmers began to organize together because they saw that their interests were unified in protecting their economic interests and protecting their farms from the threat of bankruptcy or repossession by the bankers. Add on top of it, there was another organization of sharecroppers in the South known as the Colored Farmers Alliance, because most southern states, it was illegal for white men and black men to openly fraternize. Black men had to organize into a Southern Farmers Alliance. The original populists wanted to use fusion and an alliance between the Colored Farmers Alliance and the Farmers Alliance in general to basically take over state legislatures, state governance, and send legislators as well as presidents to the White House to basically implement laws that would be designed to undermine or basically to rebalance the economic situation that the country had found itself in. One of the earliest allies to the populist movement were socialists, particularly wage workers, who at this time specifically, still didn't represent as much of the portion of the population of the country, but were a significant group of voters, particularly in the northeastern and midwestern states, particularly in places like Chicago, New York, and Boston. So this populist alliance came together, and the term populist came from the root of the fact that they called themselves the People's Party of America. They wanted to have a simple term, so they called themselves populists, which meant they were peopleists, but it was Latin. So the early populists were fairly left-wing, agrarian, reform-minded activists.
Yes, the proletariat.
Yes. Or the peasantry. But in reality, proletariat. I mean, they were working people. They just owned land, which meant they owned the means of production, and this led to a lot of infighting between orthodox Marxists and
as it always does.
Never trust an orthodox Marxist because their head is up their ass. I don't like orthodoxy. I'm a heterodox Marxist, meaning that I want solutions. I'm not interested in protecting the means of the 1850s. Okay, but anyway, getting back on track. So the populists seem to actually be pretty effective. And so here are some of their this was their bill of legislation that they wanted to see passed. Now I want you guys to listen to this really closely, because these things are going to be highly contentious issues. One, they wanted to have a fiat currency or a bimetal currency. They wanted to have silver instead of a gold standard, at least when it came to domestic markets. The reason for that is that silver would basically inflate the value of the dollar because there'd be more dollars in issuance, and this would ensure that there would be more money moving around. This would allow for more credit flexibility for the farmers, and potentially this could also lead to an increase of prices for their goods that they're selling. The second thing they wanted to do was nationalize the railroad system so that it would get rid of the freight system. Now that should sound really familiar because we're dealing with a very similar problem when it comes to access to healthcare.
Hmm?
Yeah.
Third thing, they wanted an income tax that was progressively structured.
Okay.
So, if any of those things sound fairly familiar, that's kind of the point.
Yeah.
So, in many ways, the populists were heavily influenced by socialist ideology. But they also were heavily influenced by Jeffersonian as well as, what we'd say, progressive ideology. So the populists realized that on their own they really couldn't be as successful. So they began the policy of fusion, in which they would basically have one of their candidates be elected via a primary, but would stand in as either a Republican or Democrat, depending on the district, to run as an opposition to the party that was in power. So in Kansas, which was a traditionally Republican state, populists would run as Democrats. In the South, populists would run as Republicans. Make sense?
Yeah, for sure.
And oftentimes they were allied with the Farmers Alliance, local unions, and would push for economic changes. One of the key things, though, that the populists fought for was enfranchisement of the vote. Populists in the South wanted black people to vote.
Yes.
And they were very pro that. They weren't all race nice people. Many of them were racist, and they had racist opinions, but they wanted enfranchisement for the simple rationalization that it meant more votes for their side. And more importantly, they were one of the few organizations that was actually willing to work with the African American community to get policies put on board, or put forward, that'd be beneficial to the black community as well.
Yeah, cool.
So, this leads to the inevitable backlash. So, the establishment didn't really like this happening, particularly the Southern establishment, which were fucking fascists. And they were known as the Bourbon Democrats back in the day because they had a proclivity of having brandy and bourbon.
Oh,
they were wealthy folk. They were wealthy folk that had, that would smoke cigars and drink brandy from a cup. They were the bourgeois, the elite. And they had an alliance with, surprise, surprise, with a handful of northern financial companies. Because, surprise, surprise, many of them were the owners of the land that the sharecroppers were working on. And so they were getting a piece of the pie.
Shocking.
So, the Southern Democratic Party pushed a radical white solidarity ideology forward. And they began to pressure the Republican Party to begin to do the same. In the North, white solidarity, after the rise of the populist movement, became a bigger and bigger issue. Now, a funny thing happened in 1894. 2 years after the Populist Party was formed, one of the worst economic recessions in American history took place. And the government was run by a Democrat named Grover Cleveland. Grover Cleveland was a very orthodox Democrat, in that he wanted to maintain the gold standard and didn't want the government to get too big for his shoes and didn't want to do too much reform. So, in the middle of one of the worst economic disasters in our country's history, the guy bought gold and did everything in his power to protect the gold standard. So much so that increasingly many Democrats are worried about their prospects going forward. There was a real fear that the Populist Party might actually become a major political party. So the Democrats did something crazy. They basically offered a possibility of a fusion ticket with their Populist Party. And so they chose a Nebraska senator named William Jennings Bryan. William Jennings Bryan was not a full-throated populist, but he did want free silver, and he did want to nationalize the railway system. And he became insanely popular. But he was a Democrat. So that meant that for the for the Colored Farmers Alliance, all of a sudden they were kind of cut out of the deal. And so instead of the populist faction moving forward with the Southern Colored Alliance, Farmer Alliance with them, the Colored Farmer Alliance was basically chopped up or chopped out of the deal making and were left to fend for themselves. And many of the other populists of the South who basically had become Republicans, fusion Republicans, were also ostracized from the populist movement. But the populists in general did get a candidate that was to their liking in one of the major political parties. This is when the establishment of the United States shit itself and began one of the most racist, bigoted, stereotypical campaigns in human American history, at least, where basically they threw everything in the kitchen sink at Bryan, calling him a crazy man, a madman. Imagine if you combined Donald Trump, the hate that Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders got from our media, combine that together for William Jennings Bryan.
Okay.
And basically Bryan got crushed by a senator named William McKinley.
Okay.
William McKinley was in favor of tariffs and the gold standard and deunionization, projecting American power. I mean, he'd be the guy that would lead us into the Spanish-American War, so we could take control of Cuba and Puerto Rico and the Philippines. But the establishment of the time supported McKinley over Bryant because Bryant was crazy. He was an insane man, wanting things like free silver and to nationalize the railroad system. As a consequence, the election of 1894 was a blowout for the Republican Party. Bryan would be the nominee for the Democratic Party multiple times, and multiple times he would lose. And I believe the Democratic Party remained out of power from McKinley all the way to Taft until Woodrow Wilson came into power. And by then, the Populist Party no longer existed, and the underlying socioeconomic issues of the day were left undiscussed and unresolved. And this led to a lot of social instability, and this led to one of the largest, this led to what was known as the nadir of American racism. This is by far one of the most racist periods in our nation's history, and that is saying something. From 1896 all the way to about 1930, 1932, and to be particular, 1933, when a Roosevelt became president. The United States became an incredibly racist, bigoted society, became far more racist, more bigoted, became more openly so. And we saw a revival of lynching laws, which had gone on the by and by, largely due to populist fusion and activities of the Southern Farmers Alliance working with the Black or the Colored Farmers Alliance. Cities would be invaded by radical establishment-backed red shirts, as they were called, because they'd all wear red shirts, go in and kick out Republican governments in the South, and impose Democratic government, Democratic mayors, and anybody who tried to resist them would be killed or lynched.
Wow. Crazy time then.
Yeah. So, this is a part of American history that we really don't talk much about. But let's understand that the establishment the wise ones, the academia, the people that we're supposed to be listening to, endorsed it. Or at least were silent on the violence and the rhetoric that was used. In result, the populist faction was crushed in the South, and it really wouldn't be until the New Deal that populism really got a new breath of life. And this is where you get into really contentious territories, because I would venture to say that the New Deal was more populist than anything else. But there are many well-educated Brahmins that would say no, it was actually an expert-led progressive movement. And they would cite the fact that Henry Wallace, who was a well-educated academic, was the head of the agricultural department of the United States, ignoring the fact that there were a lot of people who were not academics or not from the established academia that were part of the Roosevelt administration. So, suffice to say, the New Deal, I would venture to say, was actually a successor of the populist movement. And I would venture to say that actually the Civil Rights Movement was a successor to the populist movement. There's a lot of evidence to that. In fact, that the Civil Rights Movement grew out of the Southern Farmers Alliance, and the Colored Farmers Alliance in particular. The organization that existed, that the Southern Colored Alliance was able to maintain, was through their churches. And Martin Luther King, as we know, was I
can't remember which church he was with.
He was a reverend, though.
Yes.
Reverend, sorry.
So, I would say that the populist movement of the late 19th century had more to do with the progressive and what we call left-wing revolution of the 20th century than what many in establishment circles would like to believe. So, but every time, all the time, the same cast of characters from the same institutions would come out and say this was dangerous and we needed to, not listen to the rabble-rousers. There were many a Harvard professor that came out against the statements and the actions of the Roosevelt administration, as well as the actions and statements of Martin Luther King. So, that's basically it. I would say that the Bernie Sanders movement and what we saw with the left, like with the squad, is more of a indication of American populism than anything that Donald Trump was about. Because Donald Trump, when analyzing things that he said, more in line not with radical degeneracy in American history, but instead in line with establishment sentiments.
Yeah, I think the scary thing about Donald Trump, though, is that he was able to weaponize a lot of populist, talking points. And he was able to touch on a lot of, really populist-sounding ideas, but then back policies that were completely against it.
So, I would say he did. I mean, he didn't, though. Populists never advocated for tariffs. They never advocated for protectionism. In fact, if you were a farmer, you wanted more markets for access because that meant you potentially could have more profitability. I mean, even on the issue of immigration, a lot of people said that this was a historically populist rhetoric, but when you look at what the populists actually said about immigration, a good chunk of them were not anti-immigrant. In fact, they wanted immigration because they saw it as a benefit, because most immigrants were probably going to come in and ally with their interests, because economically speaking, they were more similar. I think a problem is that a lot of people are heavily indoctrinated by the class reductionist rhetoric that
I guess that's more what I was gunning for, is he used a lot of class talking points of the upper elites, this group of high standing people, they're the ones out to get you.
You know what's really funny is that most of the populists really didn't even talk that way, though.
Mm-hmm.
They talked about how the banking infrastructure and the bankers were a problem because it was in their incentive to behave in a certain way that squeezed profits from people. Mm-hmm. And a lot of the reforms they were designing to do, had the federal government nationalized the railroad industry, finance wouldn't have gone away, and finance would still make profits. but they would have been forced to basically invest in different infrastructures for those profits. In fact, one could argue that had the federal government nationalized the railroad system, we would have not had as many recessions, because many of the economic turmoil that would take place throughout the world would be the result of railroad companies collapsing. This is one of the reasons why the British government, as well as the Canadian government, nationalized the rail systems after World War II. It was designed to stabilize economics because transportation is a huge part of trade, and trade's a huge part of economics. Donald Trump never called to nationalize anything. He never called... Go ahead.
I think, what you're saying with what you just told us, that's true, but I think he was able just to get away with it just because we're not taught the history of populism.
Mm-hmm.
So,
I think that
it's not correct, but I think he was able to get away because I've heard the term populism referred to his campaign a lot, and I just think it's the fact that people are aware.
So why was it ascribed to his campaign? Who called him populist first? It was the media. So, this is where the history of anti-populism comes back around like gonorrhea. Okay? There are a lot of people, like George Wallace was called a populist. This is a establishment of a Democrat that you could possibly have running Alabama for decades. A Southern Democrat running Alabama for decades is a populist. So the narrative of populism, the anti-populist rhetoric, has its own history. I would implore everybody to read The People Know by Thomas Frank, because this is a good starting point and understand the history of what I can frankly call bullshit history. It started with a man named Richard Hofstadter, who was a Jewish man growing up in the Midwest and no doubt dealt with anti-Semitism. But he basically came of age and came into academia during a period of time of social reform. Had Richard Hofstadter been born a generation earlier, most likely he would not have been allowed to attend higher institutions of the Ivy League because they were some of the most anti-Semitic institutions in the country. Or at least we're going through an anti-Semitist phase. Richard Hofstadter, who came into age in the 1940s and 1950s, the nation of the United States was dealing with the ramifications of the Holocaust. So Richard Hofstadter went to college to a prestigious university, and he found a lot of rhetoric that was printed about populists, and he found out about racist populists, which there were racist populists, and concluded that the populists were the ones that were responsible for the revival of racism, or the nadir of racism, because you saw a nadir of racism with the rise of populisms. Unfortunately, Mr. Hofstadter didn't take into consideration that correlation does not equal causation. And so many of the historians at the time criticized Richard Hofstadter. Now, Richard Hofstadter wrote a big piece of legislation. It was his magnum opus, where he basically detailed the rise of the American century and used populism as, a kind of a antagonist of this progression. And instead of recognizing that the fact that it was the populists themselves that were raising the alarms and calling for reforms, instead, the populists were hayseed redneck types who were dealing with a term known as status anxiety. Now, we've heard this term a lot, status anxiety. People who vote against their interests. This kind of rhetoric. Well, Richard Hofstadter was denounced by many other American historians and actual populist historians, pointing out the fact that some of the most racist and anti-Semitic rhetoric was not, in fact, coming from the populists, but were instead coming from the Republican Party and the Democratic Party at the time, particularly the Southern Democrats and the Midwestern Republicans. Many of them pointed out the revival of the Ku Klux Klan in the 1920s was not led by populists, but instead were led by Midwestern Republicans and Southern Democrats, many of whom were bourbon Democrats, many of whom were not farmers. So, the largest, do you guys know where the largest Ku Klux Klan rally ever took place was?
No.
It was in Indianapolis. Indianapolis, Indiana. The largest Ku Klux gathering in American history happened in Indianapolis.
How big?
It was, I want to say it was around 30,000 people.
Wow, that's massive.
I heard this factoid. I don't know if maybe you can corroborate it, but I can't remember exactly what time period it was, but I think it was 6% of America were card-carrying KKK members.
Yep.
6%.
Yep.
That's crazy.
Yep.
Yeah, that's a lot.
And this was throughout the country. These were Democrats as well as Republicans. These were in western states, northern states, southern states, across the board. So,
oh my God.
Let's get that with the vaccine cards, please.
Well, I think fortunately we're
6%.
more. I think it's more than 6% now. But getting back to my point, fellas.
Yeah.
I know.
It's fine. I would say that what's really what I'm really trying to get at here is that Richard Hofstadter's work, though, gained a lot of prominence in Europe. Gained a lot of prominence in Europe because what he detailed, ironically, what he was detailing, and this kind of just shows a little bit of projection, he was basically making the populist movement out to be kind of proto-Nazi. His book came out in a time when Europe was going through a time of reflection. And a lot of people saw a lot of similarities of what Richard Hofstadter was writing about, how he was basically shaping the populist movement in the United States with the rise of fascism in Italy and Nazism in Germany. And so very quickly, populism became synonymous with right-wing populism, or nationalist populism. The reason for that was that the left in Europe did not want to associate itself with the nationalist socialism, for obvious reasons.
Yeah, I was going to say it makes sense at the time.
Because that kind of language of socialism was used in Italy as well as in Germany by the fascists. And they wanted a different term to describe the rise of basically fascism in Europe, of these authoritarian, right-wing, nationalist organizations. And they didn't want to use the word socialist. And they didn't necessarily want to use the word nationalist because many of nationalism still didn't have as much of a bad taste in people's mouths. So they chose populism. And so populism turned into a term to describe right-wing ultranationalism and xenophobia and ethno-nationalism in Europe. It spent a couple decades in Europe until it was imported back to the United States during the 1960s, 1970s, into the 1980s. And that's the 1970s in particular, where the term populist kind of took on a life of its own. Jimmy Carter was called a populist. This was a governor of Georgia, as establishment as you could get.
Yeah.
Ronald Reagan was called a populist.
Oof. Oof.
Yeah, George Wallace was called a populist. Nobody really knew what a populist was or what populism was about. And it's because the definition or the term populism had become archaic in American politics for a variety of reasons. One was the fact that liberalism, what we call left-wing politics, essentially adopted populism, or at least the populist movement, into its own ranks. And many of the socialists and baby boomer generation didn't call themselves populists because that would be too would have been too mom and pop, you know what I mean, man? Be too much about the system, man. And so populism as a right-wing hayseed redneck ideology became the predominant perception of populism, because like this European version of populism made its way into the United States, and the baby boomer generation was just ready to indulge and consume this definition of a populism. And so populism in American politics very quickly turned into nationalist or national-centric, ethnocentric rhetoric. America First became populist instead of internationalist, which populism had historically been. Unfortunately, at this time, the populist faction or the left-wing faction of the Democratic Party was largely marginalized, and this was due to its association with the either its association with being pro-Vietnam War, anti-Vietnam War, but also due to its association with the Johnson administration, which was not very popular. And then you got a guy named Richard Nixon. And guess what Richard Nixon was called?
Populist.
Because he had an everyman narrative.
I was going to say tricky dick.
But now we understand that the caricature of populism, that stereotype, had become the actual thing what populism was being discussed about, not what actually populism was. And so this is one of the reasons why Trump was called a populist, even though he really didn't offer any populist solutions. So this is how words and meaning kind of matter. And this is also one of the reasons why I'm kind of mad at the current populist movement that exists in the United States, because the populists themselves were reformers, not revolutionaries. And they wanted to restructure the economic order of the United States, not tear down everything and burn it. This is one of the reasons why they came into conflict with, once again, the orthodox Marxists that believed only through revolution could, a socialist society be achieved. So this is where, we need to talk about the current state of populism, which is far more influenced by the caricature than the actual historical reality. So, Shu-En Head calls herself a populist. I would say she's actually more in line with populist. But she also talks about protectionism, and I'm not for protectionism because protectionism really doesn't benefit the working people for that much. It can protect certain industries and people working for those industries, but it usually has long-term knocking effects on the rest of the economy, as we saw with the steel industry when Trump implemented a steel tariff with China. It benefited the steelworkers for a minute, but it had led to long-term consequences because it increased the cost of production of steel, which increases the cost down the line. And the question is, are we as a society willing to take on those burdens? Or is there another way for us to have handled the situation that would have resulted in the steelworkers of the United States having some more securities?
So there would have been better ways to approach it than that.
Mm-hmm. So that's my point. I'm going to let you guys have the floor because I'm going to need a second to get my voice back.
Okay. I don't know. I just feel that, certain groups and different parties have learned how to weaponize, populist, not even talking points, but, rhetorical strategies that have kind of garnered a base around them. And I think that's pretty unfortunate. And I think we really need to become almost surgical in how we, dissect arguments and talking points with that, because it can be dangerous in the long run.
It's a great term to kind of hide behind, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Because populism, people, Trump's a populist, he cares about the people, and I do like that you were able to put it kind of in that perspective that other presidents were called this as well, even though they weren't. Mm-hmm. That makes a lot more sense now, because I was always wondering how they were kind of able to get away with that, but I guess it's been happening.
Been like that for a long time, yeah.
Yeah.
You know who was called a populist? Clinton. Bill Clinton was called a populist.
Oh, jeez.
Ugh, hurts. You hate to see it.
So the reality is populism has been weaponized as a term. So for people who you like, yeah, they're populist, man. They're for the people. The people who you're against, oh man, they're populist. They're just appealing to the most deplorable crowd.
Mm-hmm.
This is one of the reasons why Hillary Clinton used the word deplorable. They're what did she call them? A bag of deplorables.
Yeah, something like that. Ugh.
And so, I mean, the reality is the populist faction, or their successors. So they were heavily influenced by populism, but they became successors to it. The New Dealers is what I would call them, and the New Deal was an alliance between populists, socialists, heterodoxical socialists for the most part, and the experts, the establishment, that were a little too unorthodox for their own good. And from this, the New Deal was formed. There was no one universal group that got everything they wanted, but it was an alliance between these three factors. And this alliance was maintained largely through the Roosevelt administration, the Truman administration. They stayed allied with one another during the Eisenhower administration, but the fraying began to happen underneath the Kennedy administration. And this is largely due to the result of Hofstadter, but also due to the fact that the socialist faction was allied with working class issues, and the populist faction was allied with working class issues, but the academic faction was become more aligned with establishment issues, ergo big money.
Mm.
And so there was a rift that was beginning to form even internally within these groups as academia became more socialist inclined, if you will, especially with the baby boomer generation. Unfortunately, it was orthodox Marxism that was taught in academia, hence why there are a lot of people who graduate from academia that tend to either project orthodox Marxism or Marxist-Leninism as their terminology, because these were the two established, legitimate forms of Marxism, all the while ignoring the large confederation that the socialist movement of America was. That had very different alliances. And so socialism in the United States took a huge hit in the 1950s as a result of the Red Scare. And that was the first pillar of this triangle alliance to take a hit. Academia used this time to reassert itself as the establishment, and the populist faction very quickly had to deal with the socioeconomic fallout of the New Deal and had to find a new way of handling itself without the support of the socialists. So, in result, by the time you get to Kennedy, Kennedy surrounded himself with who?
Not sure.
The Camelot Squad. They were Camelot. Ivy Leaguers.
Oof.
Academics. Johnson, who's his VP, was a New Dealer. He was the product of that tri-alliance of academia, populists, and socialists. Or at least heterodox, pro-union. And when Kennedy's inner circle did not like Johnson very much. They saw Johnson as old school. And many of the boomer generation would begin to look at the populists or the New Dealers, and I'm going to call them that, because the New Dealers were an alliance of this, as liabilities. In result, the New Deal became a target for many of these new Democrats.
Interesting.
So, Kennedy gets assassinated. Johnson comes into power, and what's the first thing that Johnson does? He pushes for the Civil Rights Act.
Yeah.
King.
A old populist line. This is a racist Southerner, right? This is corn cob pop. This is a racist, and he's pushing for the Civil Rights Act because he realizes, in the long run, having more people of color voting means that they're probably going to vote for you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And this was a major contentious issue. This led to a fight, a true internal fight inside the Democratic Party between the established Bourbon Democrat faction, that was a holdover that had become increasingly isolated within the Democratic Party, and the rest of the Democratic Party. But the people who were leading this, were they hayseed rednecks?
I don't think so.
No, they were the Bourbon Democrats.
Yeah.
They're the rich folks of the South that wanted to keep black folks in line, because black folks in line mean cheap labor. And if the black folks remain cheap labor, that means the white folks are going to remain cheap labor. The Civil Rights Act was a direct threat to their economic superiority. It also was a direct threat to their sense of racial superiority. So who was against the Civil Rights Act? It was the establishment.
The Democrats.
The established Democrats. It was Southern established Democrats. Ironically enough, many of the Southern established Democrats within a decade would become... Starts with an R.
What was that?
What was that?
Many of these establishment Democrats would eventually become, and it starts with an R.
What are you saying? Republicans.
They would become Republicans. And surprise, surprise, many of these Southern districts became...
Red states.
Republicans.
Rip in peace.
And
that shift
that took place, and instead of the shift taking place where that would permanently isolate the reactionary Southern conservatives and the reactionary elements in our society, instead, what did the Camelot Squad do? What did the Baby Boomer Camelot Alliance do? It began a 40-year crusade to decouple the populist left-wing reformist tradition from the Democratic Party by becoming anti-New Deal.
Interesting.
And so the Republican Party was able to adopt the "I'm for the common people" rhetoric. And we've had 40 years of demagogical Republicans talking about how they're for the common people while basically raping and pillaging all the way they go. And the Democratic Party standing up and courageously saying, well, that's just not how it's done, sir.
Interesting.
So,
and very sad.
So this leads to the conclusion of why are so many flippin' populists borderline Nazbol?
Well, I mean, it just sounds like it. It was socially crafted by higher ups and elites.
What it is they're class reductionists, and they somehow think, and this once again is the stereotype. So America is a racist country. How is it racist, and why is it racist right now? I don't think it's because most people are racist themselves and that they hate people of color. So it's institutionalized.
Yeah.
So why is it a problem to adopt a class reductionist line when you don't truly understand the causes of racism? Because you begin to appeal not to actual working class people, but to their caricatures. There was no Archie Bunker in real life, but the Archie Bunker stereotype is how we perceive working class blue collar people. I mean, technically speaking, we're working class people. Do you guys call people meathead and, have racist, bigoted perspectives that you're not willing to let go and you're crotchety?
I would sure hope not.
I don't know.
So why is that caricature in place? Because it's reinforced by our media. This is part of that whole stereotype being reinforced. How the populist stereotype is constantly being reinforced. So, I mean, the solution to the problem is not class reductionism. Because who you're appealing to might not actually be working class. They're just pretending. Now, let's take the Trumpers who invaded the Capitol. Those people aren't poor.
There was a lot of wealthy people that did that.
Mm-hmm. but they dressed like working people. They acted like working people because it's a stereotype. It's easy to reenact a stereotype because stereotypes oftentimes are inorganic. They're a caricature. They're made up of tropes. Most Trump voters, most Republican voters have money. We see this time and time again when it comes to the income bracket. They're not wealthy. They're not poor folk. They're not working class folk. Most of these people have money. They own businesses, but they come out. They don't make up a large portion of the population, but they do come out to vote because they have skin in the game. When you have skin in the game, you have a natural incentive to want things to go your way. So, that's my very brief cover of populism. Do you guys have anything to add?
As I said, I think my closing thoughts are it's interesting, like, what groups of people will, like, come out and, like, not only vote, but, like, argue to represent for themselves when they're almost aligned with us, like, as lefties. Mm-hmm. Like, I think a lot of people, it's really sad to see in the Republican Party. I'm like, man, like, if you could just drop, like, one issue or two issues, like, you and I would probably, like, agree down the lines, but you cannot get past this.
Yeah, they're, like, very close
to
that point.
So that's a wedge issue. You know what I think is a good example of a populist movement in the United States? It's BLM.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a people's movement. It's organized. It's diverse. There's socioeconomic issues that they're bringing up. They're very disciplined. I mean, I say that that's populism.
Yeah, I agree.
It doesn't have to be ideologically pure, because it's not about the ideology. It's about the ideals. It's about the principles of the thing. And by hook or by crook, they want to have these policies implemented. So, I mean, the real problem is that the media created the narrative of Trump, the common man. And they reaped the whirlwind for that. When in reality, this is a billionaire blowhard. He went to all the same prestigious universities as everybody else that's part of his class.
And started his own fake one.
Started his own university. This is a guy with money. He might be rude, but to attribute rudeness and crassness to working class people right out the bat and define them solely off of that is a problem, because that's what's, again, class reductionism. It's an assumption. It's a stereotype. It's an appeal to a stereotype that doesn't exist. Or at least a stereotype that does not make up a large proportion of a population. So,
yeah.
Any closing arguments, guys?
Well, as I was saying, I think I kind of said my piece on that. It's just we've got to be surgical in how we tackle a lot of this. Really, it comes down to that. We've got to really pinpoint our arguments, pinpoint the problems, and hammer on those.
Yeah, I mean, it was very interesting to learn about the history, and I think a lot of things, I think I was able to click a lot of questions that I have. Mm-hmm. And so I would say maybe if there's a term being thrown about, especially if it doesn't make sense, I would really dive into the history of that. And I mean, I know that's kind of what we try to do on this show, but don't just hear that and just take it, or just deny it and move on without really knowing. I would say just dive in, and then, who knows, you might learn that this has happened before. This isn't anything new.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And that's the key thing I wanted to bring up, is that this all happened before. We've always had demagogues. We've always had people that promise to give power to the people but keep it to themselves. There's nothing new in democracy, but to label them as populist while ignoring the tradition and history of the term is not only stupid, it's dangerous. Because it gives these people a pathway to power that would be would be arguably, off the table for them. Because by giving the Republican Party, and particularly Donald Trump, the term populist, you're giving them a long history, a strong tradition, a traditional history in the United States that holds a lot of resonance and a lot of meaning to a lot of lay people in this country. Like Thomas Jefferson, Thomas Paine, Abraham Lincoln. These are very powerful figures in the psyche of the American people. And by relinquishing populism to describe just a base appeal to the people, you're relinquishing Lincoln, you're relinquishing Jefferson, you're relinquishing Paine, and you're relinquishing FDR. And you're giving them over to people who have no interest of emulating these presidencies and these people and are more interested in preserving their own power. Well, this has been Goodfellas History. If you like what you heard here, please like, subscribe, and share and comment below. And have a great day.
See you guys.
Bye, guys.